My name's Oliver Emberton. I'm the Managing Director of Silktide, and today I'm going to be giving you a roughly 50-minute talk on making accessible web forms. Hopefully we'll have a little time at the end for questions. Maybe we skip that off, but we'll see how we do. So what are we going to cover today? I'm going to break it out into three key areas for forms. The first section is going to be the appearance of forms, the design aspect, if you will. Semantics, which is going to be looking a little bit into the code. We're going to spend quite a bit of time there. We're going to go through some of the technical details of accessible forms. And then finally, we're going to look at the flow. So the flow is going to be the way that forms actually operate kind of from start to finish. So let's get started with appearance. So the first thing we're going to look at is boundaries. So this is a new concept in WCAG 2.1 that refers to the contrast of form elements, and specifically kind of the whether or not you can understand the boundary of a form element and kind of identify where that form element is and what it is. So what we see here on the left-hand side is a standard form field for a name, and this has relatively high contrast. This has a fairly thick black border, and on the right-hand side we have the same control, but with a slightly trendier, softer edge sort of shadow effect, quite common nowadays. Now, under this requirement, the second control would not be classed as accessible, because although you and I may be able to perceive the edge of that field, not everyone can, as we'll see. Now, one key aspect of this requirement is it's not all about adding thick black borders to everything. It's just about making sure elements are clear. So, for example, you might add a background color around a field, and that would achieve the same requirement. That would make it apparent that there is a field there and that you can use it. Unfortunately, in this case, I've actually tricked you, because that color green isn't quite contrasting enough. It looks like it is, but it isn't. Under WCAG, that color is actually not sufficiently differentiated from white, which it's adjacent to. So you would actually fail WCAG, even though that looks, I think to most people, that might look like, oh yes, that's really, really clear. It wouldn't be. And this is one of the reasons why you actually need to get into the detail and sometimes check these things. So let's go through a few more fields. So quickly, I've got a drop menu, I've got a checkbox, I've got some kind of 5-star rating widget, and I've got a toggle button at the bottom. And all four of those would actually fail under this requirement, purely down to their contrast. The green you saw on the previous screen is not contrasting sufficiently with the white or the kind of eggshell gray around it. And if you were to compare this with, say, a more accessible variant, here I've used a stronger, more differentiated color. I've used a sharper border, and the kind of the carré, if you will, on the drop-down menu is clearer. And in particular, things like the text on, although this distinction may seem subtle, like those two may look the same to like a casual observer, the one on the right is substantially more legible. And I can show you this if I was to simulate some form of visual disability. So here, what you're doing is we're essentially just lowering the visual contrast and blurring. But a lot of information is completely lost when this happens. And many people have vision that, from a functional perspective, it may not look like this, but from a functional perspective is equivalent to what you're seeing here. So things like those toggle buttons being completely lost, you just have no idea what's going on. The final star on the star rating is basically invisible. And even that checkbox, surprisingly, may be difficult or impossible to discern. There's actually a subtle additional like double check here, which was not apparent. If I go back, the stars that you're seeing on the left actually have to contrast twice. So for most of these things, you're just worried about, like the checkbox, does it contrast with the surroundings? But with the stars, the star needs to contrast with the background if it's filled, but the unfilled star also needs to contrast with the background and with the filled star. So that's why you've got this kind of thick border here. It's not enough just to make sure that this star is different, is sharp against the background. It also needs to be different against the star next to it. This is surprisingly tricky. It's one of the reasons why these kind of controls are hard to pull off. So why do we care about all of this? Well, insufficient contrast prevents people with low vision from using forms completely, right? So if you have a visual impairment, a large number of visual impairments will affect you in a way that makes forms like this completely unusable. And you can literally just discern it from sight. You can look at a form, or a tool can look at a form and can just tell you, yeah, that's not going to work. So a form like the one you see here on the left, quite trendy, quite tasty, quite fashionable, unfortunately would fail in all manner of ways. So moving on to labels. Now, anyone who's worked with accessible forms is probably sick of this word, but let's talk a little bit about it. So what is a label and why do we care? Well, if we take a form like this one, we've got a clear label at the top. So the label is basically telling you what needs to go in the field, right? So in this case, I'm after your email address, or maybe I'm after your name or whatever. The placeholder is text that is inside the field, and that when you type inside the field, that text goes away. So it's a relatively modern invention. I mean, I think it's like 8 years old now or something, but placeholders typically are a sort of fainter shade of gray or something, so they're more subtle. And they can provide things like examples, like you see here, an example of an email address. That, at least in theory, is what they are, and that's what you should be doing. But unfortunately, a lot of people kind of get them mixed up. So it's quite common to see a form like this, where someone uses a placeholder in order to do what a label should be doing. So in this case, they've put what you're supposed to be typing in, you need to type in an email, they've put that inside as a placeholder. And there's a few problems here. As you saw a moment ago, that kind of gray text is basically invisible to a number of people. And so they literally won't even see it. But also you've got the problem that when you start typing in that field, you don't know what you're asked for anymore. So, all right, this was an email address, but as soon as I start typing in an email address, I've lost that information. I don't know I'm being asked for an email address. In this case, it may seem slightly like pedantic, like why would you care? But consider a slightly more elaborate form like this. So this form doesn't have labels, it just has placeholders. And because I've filled in some of that form, or maybe the form is automatically filled in for me, I can't see what the labels are. So I can guess, maybe that's asking me for the first line of an address, maybe a street name, a city, but I don't actually know. The only way I could actually know what those fields are is if I deleted the text inside each one, which is crazy. And that last fourth field, I have no idea. I mean, is that like the house number? Is that the area code? It's like that, as it happens, that's actually the international dialing code for the phone number. But how could you possibly know that? So for all of those reasons, labels, really important design affordance you should actually be making visible on the page. And there are many ways to present them, but these are the three most common very quickly. The first approach, you put the label on the top left. The second, you tend to put it on the left-hand side. And the third, you kind of inline it. So this is often known as like a floating label. This is quite trendy and modern at the moment. So let's just do a very quick comparison. So the first approach has an obvious advantage, which is if you're on a small display, it tends to fit. It uses less space, basically, or less width, I should say. So just if you, this isn't necessarily saying it has to go off the edge, but it gives you more room. If you imagine a wide field, so email is not a very wide piece of text, but say you had something like postal address or home address or whatever, that's a lot of text to fit on the left-hand side of a field. So it's generally better, I would recommend, to stick the label on the top left. That is not a WCAG requirement, just better practice. It's also slightly less scrolling for people. If they do have to zoom in and scroll, it's slightly easier to use the first one. The other design option, which is the kind of the floating label, very trendy at the moment, like I said, is a bit of a religious debate over whether or not these are good or bad. Generally, they're treated with skepticism in the accessibility community. The main problem with them is it's typical that the label text is smaller and harder to read. But I do think it is sometimes possible to make it work, like you've got here. I think that email could be clear enough. So really matter of personal preference, I would say, but just make sure people can still read the label. Why do we care? Well, if you don't have a label at all, forms are completely inaccessible. I mean, consider that this form on the left-hand side, you wouldn't know what you're doing. Without visible labels, there are ways to add hidden labels, which we'll look at in a moment. But generally, it's kind of discouraged. The problem is labels are useful for everyone. So unless you've got something like a one-field search form or something, I would generally recommend adding a visible label. And they are required for WCAG. So you have to have a label in there somewhere, even if it's an invisible one. Right, so moving on to something called focus. So again, this will be familiar for the web devs in the room. This is a very simple form. And we have something called a focus state for all of these controls. And what that is something like this, where I say select that first field. Maybe I click inside it. Or I go to the next field, or I go to the next field. And so you've seen this, no doubt, where you can kind of go between controls and see what's selected. Now, this is often overlooked. So people maybe think about the first one. They think about the text field changing when you click inside it. They often don't think about things like radio buttons or checkboxes or even buttons. And that's because they're used to clicking on them or tapping on them. But if you're using accessible technology, there's a good chance you're selecting them through another means. So for example, you might have an accessible switch, which is something akin to using the keyboard, right? In fact, you can try this with a keyboard. Just go into a form and use the tab key to select the various controls, and you should see them light up like this. But too often, people don't design for it. They don't think about it. It's not clear. It's completely missing. And if that's the case, the form is totally unusable. There's actually a proposal in the next version of WCAG, which is under draft 2.2, to mandate just how much contrast there should be between these two states. That hasn't been finalized right now, but if you're curious, they're looking at something like take the maximum width or height, so whichever's longest, and then require twice that many pixels to change, which is potentially confusing, but there you go. So that would allow for things like a thick underline or a border or something to distinguish these two. Why do we care? Well, without focus, your forms are unusable via the keyboard at all. Like, you can't see what you've selected, right? And that corresponds to many common assistive technologies that you also need to support. And it is, again, it's a requirement for WCAG. So pretty important, pretty fundamental. And then let's take a quick look at valid and invalid states. So this is when you have a field in a form and you want to signal that the field is incorrect, or in some cases, you want to signal that the field is correct. Particularly the left-hand side is very common. And a common problem people have is that they signal this information exclusively through color. So what you're seeing here is a red field on the left where this is incorrect, and a green field on the right. But if I were colorblind or had some visual impairment that affected my perception of that color, I might not notice this information. And so all I know is, well, nothing. I just know the form didn't work and I don't know why. So there are several standard things to do here. One is to add some kind of visual indicator that is not subject to the color. So for example, here I've added an icon, a little cross, a little tick. So that can be perceived without the specific color. And also adding a text affordance here is useful. So we've got not a valid email address or looks good. Some indication like that makes it clearer for people. And again, if you pull the color out, nice and clear, super simple, works for everyone. So again, not everyone can see color clearly, and without an alternative, that information is inaccessible. So nice, simple fix there. Right, so that's enough about the appearance. We're going to spend most of our time today diving into semantics. So I'm going to talk a little bit of code. Hopefully that doesn't put anyone too far off. It's not going to be crazy complicated, but it'll certainly help if you know a little bit of HTML. So the first thing I want to look at is built-in field types and validations. So HTML is a fluid thing, and it has a tendency to change all the time. It's regularly updated. There's new concepts introduced. And in my experience, it's quite common for people, including myself, to fall out of touch with some subtle new thing they've introduced that you can start using. So I'm just going to recap a few of those and where we're currently at, because it often surprises people. So hopefully you already know buttons and checkboxes and file uploads and text and radio and all that stuff. That's kind of boring, and I'm going to assume everyone here knows that. But there are a few you may not be familiar with. These were introduced with parts of HTML5 a long time ago now. And some of these are definitely ready for prime time, and a couple of these maybe not so much. But the idea is there are progressively more native field types that are available to you. And one of the advantages of these, in theory, is they take care of a lot of accessibility problems for you, and they offer a better user experience for everyone, including users of accessible tech. So you can see some examples. There's a date picker on the left, there's a color picker in the middle, and so on. These change depending on the device and the browser you have. But the idea is, in theory, they've actually been optimized for that device. So for example, a mobile phone might have a date picker that resembles the one you're used to using on that phone. Unfortunately, the one that we all want to use, which is the date picker, is still not quite ready, and I really hope I can change this slide next year. So it's very, very painfully close. This is the field you see here on the bottom left. So this is great. It's a built-in date picker. It works on almost everything except for Desktop Safari, which it has just been added to, because Desktop Safari is the Internet Explorer of 2021. And so, yeah, it's not quite there for Safari, and there's a couple of edge case issues with some screen readers and some browsers, which are slowly fading away. But unfortunately, at this moment in time, probably the best thing to do for a date still is to have what GDS does, which is 3 separate fields and give an explanation like this, which kind of sucks, to be honest. Wish there was a better way, but yeah. But most of the other controls are actually quite usable, and there are things you can do with them and others that you may not be familiar with. So this is a data list. This is a handy accessibility aid where you can actually allow people to select preset options. These are not forced, so they can type in whatever they want. But if you've got text and you're using some kind of JavaScript widget or whatever to do this, you may not know there's a native solution, and it's pretty great. It works on all the major browsers. It's super accessible. It's well thought out, etc. And you can do that with crazy stuff. You can go into things like, this is a month picker. So you may not know there's a month component in HTML, and you can actually you can label your dates and give them presets like their birthday and all sorts. There's crazy things you can do here. And these work with colors and times and sliders and so on. But again, browser support isn't quite 100%. So you can use these as an enhancement, but I wouldn't like you're going to get like 97%, 98% coverage on most of these things, but it's not quite enough that you could rely on it for every single user. What you can rely on for every single user, however, is built-in validation. And there's quite a lot of this in HTML now, and some of it gets missed. So it's worth looking at a few of these things. So the first thing is requiring a field. Believe it or not, some people somehow don't know this. I'm just going to make sure you do. This is a simple attribute required, which indicates that a field is, surprisingly, required. And by doing so, you do 2 things. You get the browser to make sure they fill it in, and it'll tell them if they don't. But you also tell accessible technology that the field is required. So when this is read out by, say, a screen reader, the screen reader will understand that that is a required field, and it will tell the user for you. Now, again, some old form technologies or development practices, maybe you'd write this your own way. But doing it with a single field like this gets you a lot of stuff for free. It's easier and it's more reliable. This is basically 100% browser coverage at this point. A few people use ARIA required, which is an old throwback thing. You don't need it, just use required. It does the same thing. And then there's more like this. I'm not going to go through a million of these, but just to give you a feel, if you've got, say, a number field, so number just lets you type in numbers, you can give it minimum and maximum. You can have sliders. They can have minimum and maximums. Again, these are basically 100% browser coverage, so it's just built in for you. It just means the user's going to get feedback right away rather than submitting a form and you doing all this extra work and giving them a message to wait for. You can even do it with that date picker. You can do minimum and maximum dates, which is kind of crazy. And validating by patterns. So if you've got something complicated, like say a postcode, It's possible to write what's called a regular expression, which looks a little bit like this gibberish here in the pattern string here. And this will this allows you to define some kind of rule, right? So this one is just saying it must be between the letters A to Z, and there must be 4 to 8 characters. And those kind of rules, again, traditionally you would write lots of your own pesky JavaScript for it, and maybe you write some server-side code for it. It's kind of a pain. You do still need to check what's going to the server, unfortunately, because someone can hack it. And if you're really unlucky, someone's got a browser from 1995 that doesn't support this. But the advantage of doing this is you get a ton of built-in validation and accessible tech for free. So these messages will be passed to accessible technologies in a way that they can relate to, and you don't have to then worry about adding all of this extra code to your code to handle it. The one subtlety with the pattern validation is you want to specify a title. Normally, the title attribute is something you avoid like the plague with accessibility. It's often mistaken as something you should use for accessibility. So people, for example, do links and they put title attributes on it, and it's completely useless. It actually does nothing for accessibility, except give you the false impression that you're making something accessible. So normally you avoid title and you just don't touch it. But this is the one rare exception where you actually do want the title attribute, because it tells the user what has gone wrong if they don't type it in incorrectly. So useful there. So why do you care about all these built-in things? Well, they're robust, right? So most of these, the main problem you might have is they're not fully supported, but virtually everything I showed you here is 99 point something % supported. And when they're covered by the major browsers, those implementations have been tested for accessibility. They will support keyboards. They will support various native controls in the operating system. So they're probably going to be better built than anything you can make, and they're going to be familiar to users. They are not guaranteed to be accessible. The main issues are you can still do stupid things, right? You could miss out labels, or you could set the colors to be illegible. So you still have to exercise some care with them, but it just makes your life a lot easier. And to give a contrasting point, this is a very common experience. Apple here has a little drop-down menu at the top of their website. And this is the sort of thing a lot of web developers spend their time doing. You know, let's make a nice looking drop-down menu. And it's really hard to make a nice looking drop-down menu that is actually accessible. You have so many things you have to think about. And Apple, in their case, well, they did. So they actually went through all of the ARIA expanded and considering like the nested options and like the keyboard fallbacks and the different browser supports and so on. And you can do it. It is possible. It's almost never worth the effort. It's a crazy difficult proposition. You have to update it, maintain it, test it. It's hard. And native controls are pretty good nowadays. So anyway, that's that. Let's move on to something new again in WCAG 2.1. This is a concept that you should basically be minimizing the amount of typing or input that your users need through something that we've often overlooked, which is autocomplete. So the autocomplete attribute, for those of you who've come across it before, is something historically you used to just go, oh, just turn that thing off. It would cause problems with forms. Maybe it would misfire. It would, fill in the wrong thing in the wrong field. And so a lot of web developers just look at it as this thing that supports an option off, and that's it. But actually, autocomplete is an essential requirement of WCAG 2.1. And there's a ton of options available now to autocomplete, like literally pages and pages of them. And essentially, autocomplete allows you to say what a field is supposed to contain in a standard way. So if possible, the browser will fill that information in for the user automatically. So the classic example you've probably seen is something like this form here in the bottom right, where you've got a name field and it's like, oh, do you mean, and then your name, right? And you can select that. But every browser, every computing device tends to have their own version of this. Your phone will do something similar. The key thing is you need to tell the browser what the information you're asking for is in a standards compliant way, and then it can provide this for them. So here's an example. Got a whole bunch of fields, telephone numbers, emails, etc. And this autocomplete attribute can be set to different values. And these values basically say, look, I want, say, a shipping address, country name or whatever. And it's able to kind of combine these values in order to both look things up and remember them for future use. Another related technology is input mode, often overlooked. Input mode allows you to tell a browser what kind of input you want to accept, and then it will optimize the experience for the user. So this is an example of a numeric field, which surprisingly accepts numbers. And so if you use this on a, say, Android phone on the left or an iPhone on the right, you'll get a keyboard that is designed just to type in those values. Now, that's a really useful thing for just any user, right? That's just more user-friendly. But if you have a physical disability, and so let's say you're relying on technology to select these buttons that could be quite laborious. So maybe, for example, you may not have seen this, there's a technology you can use a phone with where you can push a single button to use the whole phone. So you can push a button and it will kind of start scanning a line up and down the screen. And then you push the button to say, stop. And then it will scan the screen from the left to the right side of the screen. And then you'll push a button to stop. And then wherever those two lines cross over is where you will click. And that is an extremely time-consuming process. There's many variations of that. But imagine you're trying to do that with a normal keyboard and just typing in some numbers. Having the right keyboard selected saves you a ton of effort. It's so much faster. It's unbelievable. And it's so easy to add. So literally just, a few characters in your fields. You've got the same kind of thing for things like phone numbers, exactly the same, just a slightly different keyboard. And iOS, I think, recognizes, oh, you want a phone number, here's some phone numbers I know. And likewise, email addresses, URLs, pretty much everything you can think of, there's some kind of input mode. So it's worth adding those. Why does any of it matter? Well, it's reducing the cognitive burden for one. So it gives people less to think about. They don't have to go, wait a minute, what is my address? I mean, you may not think of that as a hard problem, but it is actually a challenge for some. And when you get into more difficult areas, like what's your credit card number, I think we could all appreciate that we don't usually remember all of that information, and automating it is better. If you're working with accessible tech, it's literally saving you physical labor to type this information in. It's just good for everyone. And in WCAG 2.1, this is actually required. So you really should be doing this. Right, let's talk about accessible labels. So hopefully you already know this. This is kind of bread and butter stuff, but let's get started with the basics. So all fields, as you saw earlier, must have a label. And the reason you need a label is because you need something to read out in accessible tech. You need to be able to say this field is, I don't know, in this case, full name, right? So you typically have code where you have a label tag that says, I'm a label, I am for this other thing, this is my text, and then you have the field, and that says I am, this is my ID, full name. So that just links this label with this input. Nice and straightforward. Hopefully that's obvious and you're already doing that. Buttons, as an example, have implied labels. So that means the label doesn't need to be stated. You just put it inside the button. So you have a button, launch rocket, and then that gets read out as something like launch rocket button. Again, nice and simple. But then we have problems. So sometimes we have a form like this. So you've got a search field, say, and you either don't want to put in a visual label, or you can't afford the space. An argument, it's a bit of a debate, but an argument can be made that this does not require a label for sighted users, because you could say, well, look, there's a clear search button to the right. This is a search field, so it has a little magnifying glass and stuff. It's pretty clear that that is a search. It's in the top right corner of the site. People are used to it. You could make that argument. And so you could say, in this case, you would use ARIA label, and you would actually specify what you would normally have put in a label. You would put that inside the form itself. So if you did that, it would be read out as search example field, searchexample.com field, or some equivalent, depending on their screen reader. So you gain the label without having to have a label. Alternatively, you can add a label and hide it. So, something like style display none. That works. It's exactly the same. Basically, it's just a little bit more code, so probably wouldn't bother, but whatever works. ARIA label is also useful when you have things like buttons which don't contain text. So like this button does not contain anything you could read out aloud. It just contains a graphic, right? So you can use ARIA label to say this is a close button. There's also something called ARIA labeled by, which is usually total overkill. It's essentially allows you to do it the other way around. So you say a field is labeled by something else that already exists, and you can actually combine multiple labels. So this example, if you try and follow along, is ARIA labeled by billing, which is this header 2 at the top, and then it's followed by name, which is this div above it, which confusingly isn't a label because it's combining two of them. And so you end up with this weird situation where what it'll do is it'll read out billing at the top and then name. Now, there can be reasons to do this. They're pretty esoteric. We're going to look at a better approach later on. I wouldn't worry about it, basically. But it's useful to know what it does. Why do we even care about these labels? Well, if you don't have labels, then your screen reader is completely dead in the water. It doesn't know what to say. And things like voice control, accessibility aids are also stuck because you may not notice, people can say things like select the email field or press the launch rocket button or whatever. They can say those things to some accessible technologies so their voice is understood. And those technologies rely upon these labels. So if you have no labels, the whole thing falls apart. It's completely inaccessible. Right, so next up, help and feedback. So this may be surprising to many of you who have not spent a lot of time playing with screen readers. So allow me to blow your mind, maybe. There is something called form mode. This is in JAWS, it's in a few other screen readers. And JAWS is usually considered the most popular screen reader. It's worth explaining what this is so you understand what's going to happen here, because this is a really big deal and it's so easily overlooked. Normally, when you're using a screen reader on a computer, you are using the keyboard to step through the page. So you're using various keyboard shortcuts to go to the next link or go to the next word or sentence or whatever, step back, go to headings, all that kind of thing. So you're using the keyboard to navigate. But then when you get into a form, you have a problem because you need to be able to type. And so you can't use those keyboard shortcuts. You have to be able to type into a field, right? So what typically happens is when you go inside a form, one of your screen readers will change, and they change into form mode. And form mode doesn't use the same shortcuts, and it doesn't work in the same way. And this is the crucial, subtle part. Imagine you have a form like this, right? So you're asking someone for a password, and you're telling them at the start, before you get started, you need to have 5 numbers, 13 capital letters, and 1 unusual emoji. So you tell them it's really important information, and you go into a screen reader, and it doesn't read any of it. It will completely skip it, and they will not hear it at all. Instead, they'll just get password field, and you might be like, "Wait, what? What's going on? How's that possible?" Well, let's have a look at the code. In form mode, once you go inside a form tag, all of this text just gets ignored. The navigation changes to step between the fields, the interactive parts, and everything else is skipped, usually. So what that means is literally all of this text is never even heard, and there's no way to hear it. In fact, their controls are just going to go password, and that's it. This is obviously very bad. Amazingly enough, if you were to take the same form and just move that paragraph outside of the form, it would be fine. That is one way of dealing with this problem. It's not a very scalable solution because you're going to probably want a lot more text inside your form, but that is one thing that you could do to handle this situation. So let's look at a better way. And this is field descriptions. So you know the label. So that's something like username here. We've also got description. So this is some text. It's often displayed somewhere like at the bottom underneath a field, something like this. And this is information that kind of adds information to that field. Now, if this was being read out, because that extra text is ignored, the user of a screen reader might just hear something like username text field, and that description is not apparent to them. What we need to do is we need to add a little bit of extra code. And there's something called aria described by, where what you do is you attach information that describes something to a control. So in this case, you would take the paragraph of the description at the bottom, so this must contain at least 5 characters, and you would attach this to the input above it, right? So you go aria described by username help, and then below it, ID username help. And by doing this, you're actually saying that when I select this control, I want this information read out as well. So in this case, you would get username text field must contain at least 5 characters. The crucial thing is if you're not doing aria described by, you're not getting that text. Okay, and that's really surprising, I think, to most developers. It's like, wait, what? How is that even possible? In particular, it's often surprising because it depends on the screen reader. If you're a Mac user like me and you use VoiceOver, this doesn't happen, so you don't worry about this problem. But if you use, say, JAWS on Windows, it does. And JAWS is more common, so you really need to be aware of it. It's an easy thing to miss unless you're testing a lot of screen readers. It's also useful for things like errors. So you saw an error earlier on. If you have error text and you don't link it in this way, you won't hear it. So by doing something like this, you can have the username is taken, attached to that field, and then that information will be read out when the field is selected. Okay, and then last of all for semantics, we're going to look at grouping fields. So what on earth does that mean? Well, there is a concept in HTML known as a field set, and this is basically a collection of fields. I guess it's a set of fields. And inside a field set, you have a legend, which is kind of like a heading for the field set. Typically appears at the top like this. Here we have one called languages spoken. And then you have whatever contents you need, so whatever fields you want inside the field set, and that's it. Nice and simple. Why on earth does this matter? Why do we care? Well, let's look at some radio buttons without a field set. You may remember that the text that is not directly linked to a field is going to be ignored, right? So this header 2 you have here, choose your favorite monster, that is going to be ignored, amazingly enough, because you're in a form. So you're not going to hear that. You're just going to hear something like Kraken, radio button, Sasquatch, radio button, Mothman, radio button. And that's it. And you can select one. You don't actually know what the question is. And normally, for a field, you would add a label to the field to say this is what the question is, but you can't do that with a radio button because radio button, the label is the value, right? So you need a way of grouping all these together. So you really have to, for radio buttons, you have to use a field set. And so you do a field set, you add a legend, which is now your title, and then it's exactly the same, right? But the difference is when this is being read out, you're going to hear something like choose your favorite monster, Mothman, radio button, choose your favorite monster, Kraken, radio button, and so on. So it becomes quite apparent what you're being asked and what your answers are, and it's easy to work with. Where else would you do this? Well, it's the same for checkboxes. If you've got a whole set of checkboxes, exactly the same problem applies. So same thing. Also, if you've got related sets of fields, so things like addresses here, these addresses are related in that they're all a home address, but you don't really want to say home address street, home address city, home address postcode for each label. And again, they won't hear the heading or the text or whatever above your fields. You have to link them. So doing a field set is a good solution here. And yeah, without that, the context is not otherwise apparent. Okay, and then last of all, I know we're running a little low on time, so I'm doing my best to speed through this. Flow. So this is like looking at how your forms kind of go from start to finish. So the first big question you might want to ask yourself is, do you want a single or a multi-page form? In fact, most people are so ingrained to this, they only do single-page forms, but it's definitely worth considering the alternative. So GovUK, which is done by GDS, and they really know what they're doing, they are strong advocates of multi-page forms. So chances are you've actually used one of these. What they do is they have a form like this is to register to vote, where every single page gets a single question, right? So they have a header one at the top there, you know, where do you live? and then there's just the answers and then continue. That's it, right? But it doesn't mean they have one field per question. They might have several fields. They might, say, what is your date of birth? And you've got 3 fields to type in, or maybe something else to select to say, I don't know. I guess that's a weird question, but pretend. But they keep it focused, right? It's a single question per page, very direct, very simple. There are a lot of benefits to this approach, worth considering. One is that you can retain progress, because every time they submit the form, you could save what they've done so far and keep it for later, which is great. You're lowering the amount of cognition required, so they don't really need to think about it much, which is good for everyone. It's nice to just have an interface where you're not really trying to think about it, but for some people that's a real barrier to their accessibility, so good to keep in mind. Generally, this approach is super accessible. You'll see a little bit more detail in a minute, but it's great for things like validation and so on, and just generally works really well with screen readers. You're not hearing unnecessary stuff every time you load a page, and it's just really user friendly. The only real cons, and it's unfortunate that they exist, a lot of existing technology for things like forms doesn't allow for this. Like if you've got an existing CMS or whatever, maybe it doesn't let you build them. And for some forms, it can be harder to go back than just like scrolling up the form and changing a field. But in almost every other possible way, these are generally better, especially if you've got a lot of questions being asked. So we're just going to look at validation. There's 2 things you can do with validation. There's validating before you submit a form, and then there's validating after you submit a form. So before is when you're like typing stuff in and you get feedback straight away. So let's look at that. So imagine you're writing some kind of messaging system. This looks obviously distinctly similar to Twitter. And you want to write a message, and you're going to have some indicator that you can only type in a certain number of characters. Now, this is something you're used to seeing quite often in forms, but it's not obvious how you would make this accessible, because that information, the 200 characters left, unless if you're having it read out to you, you're typing, but then you'd have to like go to the next part of the form or something, or like how would you know that it says 200 characters left? It's not obvious. And it turns out there's a technology for this, which is kind of amazing, called ARIA Live. I'm going to simplify it a little bit here, but the basic idea is you mark part of the page with this ARIA Live tag. So this is the bottom span here. And this one is marked as polite, which is what I normally recommend you use. So basically that means I want to read out what's in here, but don't interrupt anything, right? So that's the polite part. There's also assertive, which means I want you to read out what's in here, and I don't care what you're saying at the moment. Stop and read this first. So you can use that for really urgent information. But generally, ARIA Live Polite, what that will do is it will read this information out if it changes. So what that means is you could take your existing little form system you had here, and it will say 200 characters left. But if you change that text, so let's say the user types in some characters and they're typing away, and remember they're using a screen reader, so they just hear what they're typing, HELL, whatever, as they're typing in words, they'll hear them read out to them. But when they stop for a minute, when they take a pause, the ARIA Live means the browser will go, all right, let me look at this text. Oh, it says 160 characters left, and it will speak that out to them. So this is a really useful way to give someone auditory feedback on a control, even when they have no other way of perceiving it, and actually not getting in their way. It kind of only bugs them when there's like a gap in what they're doing. So it's super handy for that. Okay, and then the opposite side of that is validating forms that have just been fully submitted. So that's when you press a button and you save it or whatever. So I'm just going to give you one example, but it's a really good one. This is GDS again, because they know what they're doing. They have a fantastic user experience for validating forms. So let's break it down and see what we can learn. There are 3 key components. The first is when you submit a form, they put feedback in the title of the page. So as you can see in this, the heading of the tab here, they don't just have some generic title. They will actually say something like error, where do you live, which is telling you that field you typed in is wrong. Or they might say, thank you for completing your passport application or whatever. So the reason why that matters is because a screen reader will read out the title first. So it gives them immediate feedback that what they've just submitted did or did not work. And that's not usually obvious. If they don't get that, they have to kind of go through the page and next, until they get to where the form was, and then they hear all of the bits about the form and they hopefully guess that the form was submitted correctly. You know, what if the form's still there and nothing changed? They wouldn't know. So this tells them what did work or didn't work. Then they provide an error summary. So this is useful also for screen reader users, but it's useful for just basically everyone. Imagine you're not an especially technical user. You're not very comfortable with computers. You may not really know what to look for. Maybe you have a cognitive impairment or similar. This makes it really screamingly obvious that something did not work with what you just did. It's literally stated there is a problem. It's got a big red, yellow border. And there's a link, crucially, to where the specific problem is that you can click on, and that takes you down to the field where the actual error occurred. There's also a few other subtle things they're doing correctly here. They've got a role of alert. That is another way of doing ARIA Live equals assertive. It's the same, basically. So that is it's going to interrupt the user. It's literally going to say, whoa, there was a problem. I need to say this straight away. So as soon as the title's read out, they're going to hear that. And then this tab index actually allows the user to select this div, which is not normally the case. So they can like tab to it, and we even autofocus it. And the reason why that's done is so that it doesn't matter if there's navigation or whatever above the page. We skip all the way down to this, so the user goes straight to where their attention needs to go to. And then the last thing we do is what you saw earlier. Is they add a ARIA described by to point to an error message, and they put that next to the specific field that has a problem. And this is exactly what you saw earlier. The only subtle distinction here, they've got a field set. So that's because they've got a series of radio buttons. And so they attach the ARIA described by to the field set, not to the individual value, because that wouldn't make any sense. You know, you couldn't say England is an error or Scotland's an error, but you could say the whole set of these radio buttons has a problem. And that's it. It's pretty straightforward. They do an incredibly good job. This stuff is not easy to pull off and is basically the gold standard. So I recommend you spend some time looking at that. And then my last point is just going to be quickly on login, which is just worth knowing about. It's often one of the biggest barriers to accessibility that people have. And you may not know this, but the next version of WCAG 2.2, which is still in draft, is proposing that you basically get rid of passwords, or at least you provide a passwordless option. If you haven't seen this before, the idea, like you can see here on the right-hand side with sign into Slack, is that instead of logging in as normal, you could type in something like an email address, and then they will email you a link, which when you click on it, will log you in. And the reason why that's better for a lot of people is because it doesn't require them to remember a password. So there's no barrier to remembering a password, typing in all these weird characters that can be very slow and laborious. Removes all of that. And a lot of users prefer this anyway. It's just good UX. So another thing is showing passwords. If you have to have passwords, have a little button that lets people view them. Again, this is really helpful for people with a variety of disabilities. One of the less obvious is motor disability. So you have tremors and you might tend to double type characters. If you're typing in a 12-character password from memory and you don't know what you typed in wrong, it's a nightmare. This removes that, makes it a lot easier. Phew. Right, okay, so somehow I managed to compress that in 52 minutes, which is actually, no, 50 minutes. So that was pretty crazy. So no more, you'll be pleased to hear. But hopefully that gives you a broad overview of form accessibility from start to finish. I'm just going to talk about one last thing, which is how do you test it? And there's just a few basic approaches. The first is use your forms through a keyboard, right? Just make sure you can tab through the various fields. You can see when you're doing it. You can fill them in. You can select menus with arrow keys, that kind of thing. If you don't do that, you're missing, like, I mean, you're not accessible, period. And it's a really easy thing to do. You should test your screen readers. I always say this. There's a screen reader that is freely available on every computer you have, whether it's iOS, Android, Mac, PC, doesn't matter. They all support a free screen reader. They're usually good. You should just learn one and then try it. Of course, you should talk to disabled users and you should get them to use your website and you should listen to them. And also, please pay them for it as well. Their experience is valuable. And then lastly, and I am of course biased here because I run Silktide and we do this for a living, but there are automated tools. There are platforms like ours, which will look at all of the content and pages in your website, and we will profile the most common and significant issues, and we will raise them to your attention. So you're seeing a little hint of that there on the right-hand side. Of course, all automated tools are not capable of testing everything that manual users will detect. So the main advantage of both approaches, manual checks will look at things in great detail and will find nuances that a computer cannot appreciate, but it's quite slow and expensive to do. And you can only do it so often. Whereas automated tools are kind of the opposite, right? So automated tools will miss some things that only a person can see, but they can test all of your content and they can do it really quickly. And because they can do it quickly, they can do it regularly. So they can automatically check your things for accessibility. And basically the only approach that works, I think, is to use both. You need some combination of both all the time. We do things like, highlight pages, show you where the issues are, preview them in mobile devices, and actually indicate, issues with all of the areas I've shown you today in an automated platform. So if that's of interest to you, you should check us out. But that's enough from me today. I appreciate we did shoot over by 5 minutes. So I don't know if we really have time for questions, but if anyone wants to throw them in, I will do my best. Let's come out of here. So, oh, goodness. There we go. I hope there are people still on the call.
We don't have anything in chat. I couldn't see anything, but I'm happy to just be a little bit longer if anyone has some questions.
In the absence of questions, I'll assume I literally answered everything perfectly and there are no gaps in anyone's knowledge. Excellent. Will you be running this workshop again? Okay, so Martin asked, will we be running this workshop again? Probably not, but it is recorded and we will share it on our respective websites. There will be a transcribed version. We will also provide all the usual, basically there'll be more accessible versions of this talk provided online. So yeah, you'll probably have to wait a week or two. Okay. Well, it seems all I'm getting right now is thank yous. And so, okay, I think we'll probably wrap up there. But yeah, thanks guys for your time. Really appreciate it. I hope that was useful. Again, you can go on a website. There's a webinar section. You'll find a recording of this in the near future.
Thank you very much, guys.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank
Have a great day.
you. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.